our last speaker, we're very blessed to have as well. Rory Turnbull is a childhood friend of Lauren. She grew up running around with him as a little bitty kid, and now he's this big, brilliant man that knows a lot about plants and other stuff. And I gotta be honest, I just enjoy being around him because I get smarter being around him. He's awesome. So Rory's gonna, I can't even say what he's gonna talk about because it's a big, long topic, but we're blessed to have you share, so give it up for Rory.
Hello, hello. Is this the one? Yes. All right. So my talk is on what I call integrative land care. Been working many years in the soil and plant health space, and there's kind of different motifs or kind of core principles I've noticed that kind of bring a lot of these seeming, when you first get into it, it can be overwhelming. There's so many different facets to nature of, plant health and soil chemistry and, mulches and fertilizers, and it can be a bit overwhelming. So I've kind of over the years found that the core principles can kind of be divided into two kind of key schools of thought, which is one is carbon-based soil fertility, and the other one being natural plant health. And so, a lot for example, the carbon-based soil fertility is broken down into three components: organic matter, living mulch, and soil biology. The plant health is divided into plant nutrition, plant metabolism, and the plant microbiome. And a lot of the organic movement, the organic guys, they focus just on the carbon-based soil fertility side of the spectrum, just on the organic matter, the compost, the mulches, the soil biology, which is very, very key, and that's kind of what a lot of the chemical or conventional farmers are lacking, is they're just focusing on the minerals and the chemistry. And because they overdo that, they wind up destroying their organic matter and their soil carbon and the living creatures in their soil. But it's what I try and teach people is it's about balancing both, because a lot of these minerals, they're not synthetic chemicals. Molybdenum, cobalt, selenium, manganese, zinc, copper, iron. A lot of people not kind of classically trained in chemistry, they don't understand that those are just natural mineral elements, and so just they're essential for all life on the planet. There's a reason why plants have to uptake these 16 to arguably 24 different key elements that all other minerals and all other molecules are made out of. And so having the right nutrition is very key, not just for the plants, but also for the microbes in the soil. And so so a big kind of, basically the big MO is you need both the biology as well as the minerals. And the biology is what gives you your sustainability, your efficiency in terms of being able to recycle what's on hand. But the minerals is what really gives you the performance, which is why, the conventional model, they focus solely on the minerals because they're just focused on yield. But in terms of quality, you really only get the high nutrient density and the healthy plant growth from having the minerals be bioavailable. And the minerals only become bioavailable to the plant when the soil is healthy, when you have the right biology and the right organic matter. So really it's about marrying the two, and really in just kind of, I've broken down, I've got these three kind of categories for each one, and then each further has 6 categories, but 3 are kind of theoretical, and the 3 are kind of practical in terms of what the benefits are they provide, and then also what are actual tools and vehicles for implementing them. And so, excuse me, I get a water. So with the organic matter, the 3 kind of practical applications there are, you have what I call ex situ organic matter, in situ organic matter, or the liquid carbon pathway. And it sounds all very technical, but it's very simple. Ex situ meaning outside of the system, in situ meaning inside of the system. The liquid carbon pathway is a pretty cool phenomena. It hasn't been known for really too long. I mean, basically the idea is that plants are absorbing carbon out of the atmosphere, and they're fixing a certain percentage of it into their biomass. So this tree trunk right here is a solid carbon tube that's stable carbon locked in a solid form. Plants are also, a lot of the liquid carbon that's soluble in their sap is actually being pumped out of their roots into the soil. And so you can build organic matter in your soil just from having living plants growing on it, let alone from the biomass decaying on the soil surface. And so, those are kind of the as far as the in situ, well, I'll just go down the list. So the ex situ being outside of the system is what a lot of people are familiar with in terms of composting. So you gather the material, take it off-site or, just kind of outside of the direct system, compost it or humify it, then bring it back to the system and reapply it. There's also fermentation, which is, because there's basically, you get too technical, but there's what makes compost so special is it's humified organic matter. So the organic matter in this tree is stable, but it's not, it'll still decompose when you put it in the soil. What it decomposes into is what is humus, which is kind of it's really the blood of the whole system, in the sense that when you think of fertile, healthy soil, most people tend to think of, black, rich soil. That black color is the stable carbon, and that a huge percentage of that carbon is in a form of what's known as humus. And humus is this really unique molecule that basically can absorb and hold on to nutrients as well as water, but it also impacts, basically the reason why it makes, you can see it on a macro level just by looking at the way black fertile soil crumbles as opposed to being sticky or, it impacts the physical structure, it impacts the chemical properties of how it actually releases and holds on to nutrients, and it also impacts the biological properties and the way living organisms can inhabit it and provide their functions and their services. And so humification is very different than fermentation. Fermentation is more of an anaerobic process in producing alcohol, and alcohol is very toxic to plant roots. It's like 1 ppm or 0.1 ppm kills plant cells. And so fermentation, you can ferment material and then reapply it, but it's just anyway, this is a bit more technical and need to go, but so fermentation is one of the key ways of recycling organic matter offsite. Then you have what's also called pyrolysis, which is a fancy word for biochar or charcoal, which is basically using fire in a airtight environment where there's no oxygen to use heat to release the oxygen from the material and just leave the carbon, which is the charcoal brick, which can then be re-implemented in the soil. And then in situ organic matter, you have sheet composting, which is basically just mulch layer building up. You've got manure of just living animals going through the system, depositing their exudates and their waste, and then you have a mulch. And so I specify the difference between sheet composting and mulch because it's very key to have a layer of distinguishable organic material on top. Like, you never want to use compost or fully humified material as your mulch. You'd want to put that down and then put a more integral organic material on top of that, because humus will decompose in the sunlight. And so a mulch acts as both a way of shielding the humus from the sunlight and from volatilizing and losing your carbon, but it also acts as a feedstock of carbon to slowly decompose into the soil. But with that, this kind of jumps up to so you have a kind of a non-living mulch of just wood chips or leaves or bark, but you can also do a living mulch, which is an entire second category here. And just as I was saying, how all plants are pumping liquid carbon out of their roots, The math on doing a cover crop versus applying mulch and compost per acre is pretty amazing. It's like the amount of carbon exudates that plants will secrete out of their roots. It's like 15 tons worth of compost per acre per season, which is like it's at a price point you can't beat it, and it's way higher quality carbon than you could really get. And so having a living mulch, just some sort of way of shielding the soil from the sun, is very, very important, in the sense that it prevents the carbon from volatilizing, but it also just acts as a feedstock to keep your carbon level in your soil. And so, yeah, the main thing with organic matter is it provides structure to the soil, provides nutrient, water, carbon storage. It also provides buffering, which is really important, like pH. You can have a really high alkaline soil pH, or alkaline pH soil, and you can actually, basically, you coat those soil particles in this carbon glue that has a more neutral pH. And then even further than that, will be conducive to biology, like bacteria or fungi, that will even further adjust the pH. And so you can, a lot of farmers spend a lot of money, a lot of energy, a lot of resources towards trying to adjust the pH of their soil chemically. They'll import large amounts of lime or gypsum or this or that. And it can be really quickly, easily fixed just by shifting the biology and providing the right carbon. And so with the living mulch, get too into it, but so the core kind of concept there is they provide biomass in terms of carbon feedstock and shielding, provides biodiversity, and having as diverse of species as possible is really important, because each species has its own microbiome and has its own waste byproducts, and the more diversity of species you have collectively producing all these different metabolites results in a wide biodiversity of microorganisms that decompose them. And that allows for, basically you get to a point in nature where the majority of the organisms present are either beneficial or commensal, which is a fancy way of saying they're benign, or they're not pathogenic. And so you have pathogens, but the majority of species that occupy the environment are either beneficial or just not harming anything. But the fact that they're taking up resources and space prevents opportunities or vectors for pathogens to emerge. And so you actually wind up creating a disease-suppressive soil instead of having to worry about controlling or suppressing them through chemical means, or even trying to find organisms that will attack specific pathogens. And that kind of segues into so you've got biodiversity, then you have bioactivity, which you can have bioaccumulation, biodeposition, or biotransformation, in the sense that you can have organisms that accumulate minerals or resources or energy into their bodies, some that deposit it into the environment in stable forms, and then others that transform it. Basically, between those three concepts, you can kind of lump any biological process. And that provides to the ecosystem protection from evaporation and nutrient leaching and volatilization, but also provides prevention from like soil erosion and compaction, and as well as cementation, which is just turning to cement, and promotes. This is really, really key. That this kind of whole concept here, the living mulch and maintaining that ecology, is kind of the crux of promoting resilience and regeneration, and kind of what's called succession in ecology, of actually, going from a grassy lot to a forest. There's a successional period there, and the key to fast tracking that or promoting that is maintaining this kind of living, basically never leaving the soil bare, always having this diverse, living mulch, essentially. And what that does is that maintains your soil biology, which is this third component here. And the soil biology it's a kind of really what sent me down this whole rabbit hole to begin with, was first learning about how 1 teaspoon of healthy soil has more life in it than the entire surface of the planet combined. Like, just there's so many different types of like, we know more about the stars than we do about soil. Like, there's just so many different, because when I first started learning about it, it was like there was an estimated 100,000 genus of fungi and 100,000 genus of bacteria. Then it went to 1 million. Then it's 5 million. Now it's like 10 million. And it's just the more they pull the thread, the more it's like, and that's just bacteria and fungi. Then there's, they're kind of, I have it broken down here. So you have bacteria, fungi, and archaea. And they're kind of like this tiny little they're almost kind of like, you could think of them like the grazers or the prey of the ecosystem, like gazelles or cows, in the sense that they're kind of just these going through the environment, eating decomposing material, kind of just consuming the environment. Then you have like the predator class, which would be like the lions and bears and stuff, things that go after those creatures. And that's what you have are called nematodes, which are basically like microscopic worms. You have protozoa, which protozoa meaning first animal. They're literally like the first evolutionary beginnings of animals from other microorganisms. And so they go around eating bacteria. And the big kind of, it's a very complex science, and you could talk all night about it, but really what it boils down to is you have this kind of class of organisms that consumes nutrients and kind of keeps them stable in their body. And then what that does is that keeps nutrients from leaching out of the system, as well as along with that carbon matrix. And then you have another class of species that eats those organisms, and their waste is the fertilizer that the plants absorb. So plants do absorb, so that's kind of where the misnomer of the chemical farming tip is, plants do absorb they need soluble minerals. So the mineral elements they absorb from the soil have to be in a water-soluble form, which in just, depleted dead dirt doesn't really have that high level of soluble minerals. That's why the whole point of the carbon matrix and these living organisms is they mine those minerals from the soil and then release soluble forms of them constantly to the plants. And so the chemical guys have that half right, where they're just applying high levels of these soluble minerals all the time, which in the short term, you get quick growth, but it quickly destroys your soil and causes all types of plant health problems, which is the second half here. But basically the goal is maintaining this, essentially you have your gut flora and your probiotics in your gut and your gut microbiome, you have a soil microbiome. And just as we're finding it's like 90% of all these key functions in our bodies reside in our gut microbiome. It's the same thing with the plants and the soil, forest ecosystems. Is they rely heavily on living soil, and so and worms and mycorrhizal fungi are very key in there as well. Let's see over those. So that segues into plant nutrition is kind of the other missing half. So a lot of people don't realize plants can be just like people, in the sense that like what most people are so, even when I say people, most like even people in the industry, farmers and growers, are so disconnected from what a healthy plant actually is, in the sense that as disconnected as we are from human health. In the sense that people think, just because someone's skinny, they're healthy, even though they could have way acidic pH, all these things that the functional doctors know about the depths of like what a healthy human truly is and could be. It's the same thing with plants. And so it's like so much of the nutrition of the plant is backed up from, we're missing this living soil and organic matter that can make the minerals available to the plant, but also a big thing is the minerals have actually been depleted from the soil. So that living system, just as I said, is that living system keeps those minerals in place, and so when we destroy that system, a lot of them either leach out or volatilize. And so kind of the three core principles of plant nutrition that I've broken down to is what's called mineral nutrition, molecular nutrition, and microbial nutrition. And so mineral nutrition is, so you've got your macronutrients, your micronutrients, and your trace elements. And these are really key because most farmers are over applying macronutrients. If anyone's familiar with gardening or farming, there's a whole thing with NPK. If you buy a bag of fertilizer, there's 3 numbers on the front. It means nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Those are the 3 most used elements by plants. And so farmers apply boatloads of this stuff, literally train loads of this stuff on the soil, even though we get too into it, but so like nitrogen, for just a prime example is nitrogen, the first one, there's 80% of the air, the atmosphere is nitrogen. It's N2, but it's in a form, it's 2 nitrogen molecules stuck together that the plant can't access. But that biology in the soil that I was just talking about can access it. And so if you have a living soil system, the plant can access all the nitrogen it could ever want from the atmosphere. Whereas, ironically, the most purchased fertilizer in the world is nitrate and ammonium fertilizer. And so this thing that farmers could be getting for free, they're spending the majority of their fertilizer budget on. But then the biggest thing with that is also over-application of nitrogen is the number one cause of sick and unhealthy plants. And so, because I have this first one, so plant nutrition, but then the second one is plant metabolism. Because you can have all of the nutrients the plant needs, but if you're over-applying them to the plant, it's not going to be metabolizing them properly. The plant has to uptake those nutrients and then digest them into the vitamins, into the proteins, sugars, and lipids, and the nutrients that we need as animals. And the over-application of nitrogen and nitrate, basically, you could go into it all night. Like it's really kind of, it's one of the main like 90% of my job working with farmers is getting them to cut back on nitrogen. And then step number 2 beyond that is, so those are the macronutrients, the most common, the most dominantly used nutrients by plants. So farmers are over applying those when they don't need to be, but then they're under applying micronutrients. And this goes for both organic as well as conventional farmers, in the sense that micronutrients are things like iron, copper, zinc, manganese, boron, molybdenum. They're elements that most conventional farmers don't think of, and then most organic farmers just kind of aren't aware of. And if they are aware of them, they think they're getting enough levels of them from their manures, or generally a lot of organic farms run pretty limited fertility programs. And so these micronutrients are really key to not only just to getting to the genetic potential of the plant. If a lot of people are familiar with the fact that the nutritional content of our crops has declined like 80 to 90% over the past 100 years. And if you look at these graphs of what the USDA defined of the vitamin and mineral content of plants, it was up here and now it's down here. To restore those levels back up to what they used to be, that's where the micronutrients come in. And so both organic and conventional farmers are really missing the boat on these guys. But then the other big thing with hitting genetic potential in terms of nutrient density and nutrient content, also growth and yield for the farmer. But the biggest thing is pest resilience. A healthy plant is 100% immune to like bugs and fungi and mold and diseases and all this stuff. Insects are nature's kind of garbage disposal. That's why you see them eating manure. Like they eat biomass that's kind of more on the realm of decaying. And when you have plants that are overfed with fertilizer, that's basically what's going on. Is they're basically water balloons full of undigested fertilizer that are going through proteolysis instead of proteosynthesis, which means that instead of forming protein, they're actually decomposing themselves to try and scavenge energy to try and process all this excess fertilizer that's in the body. And so actually getting that nutrition dialed in allows the health and vigor of the plant to reach a point to where literally the cell walls of the plant are so thick and and healthy that an insect can't even bite through it. And even if it could, the chemistry of the sap is so different, kind of like, it's like a corn-fed versus grass-fed beef. Like, it's like you read all this stuff about beef being acidic and causing all this stuff, but if you look at this, where they took the studies from, it's from factory farm cows that eat nothing but corn. And, you know, so the chemistry of that is totally different than a cow that eats grass and is healthy and, you know, lives in Iceland or wherever. And so it's the same thing with a plant. Like, literally the chemistry, the pH of the cell and the mineral composition is so vastly different in a healthy plant versus a sick plant that a healthy plant will actually make a bug sick. Like, if an insect drinks that sap, it'll actually, depending on the level, like, get too technical, but it's basically measured in sucrose. That's a good say right here. So plant metabolism is broken down into, you have primary metabolism, secondary metabolism, tertiary metabolism. Primary are things the plant has to produce to survive, just to grow and breathe and just basically come into this world. It has to produce sugar, has to produce protein, has to produce fat. Secondary metabolites are things that benefit its existence but aren't essential. Isoprenes, phenolics, and nitrogenous compounds, which all of those three are kind of umbrellaed for essential oils. Colors, flavors, smells, aromas, all the things that make insects and humans and animals and what makes organisms want to interact with plants are these secondary metabolites. Plants will only produce those if they have enough energy. You know, basically, if the first three are going properly and they have enough energy left over, then that's what they put into these secondary compounds, because they don't need those to survive. The first ones they do. Most growers, most farmers they're stuck at the first phase of that first one. They're not even getting sugar synthesis, right? Which is basically photosynthesis. Everyone's familiar with photosynthesis. That's the miracle of life. That's why we're all here, is because plants are converting sunlight into sugar. From sugar, they take a nitrogen molecule, add that to it. That sugar molecule becomes an amino acid molecule, which then becomes the basis of protein. And also that same sugar carbon chain branched is the same also chain for a fat. So literally sugar, protein, and fat, all the molecules life is based off of, are made from sunlight, water, and air by plants. And those basic processes most farmers aren't getting right. They're over applying these minerals, as I talked about, which causes, you know, the plant basically is burning excess sugar, excess carbohydrates to process the nitrogen into protein. Whereas with the living soil system, which is what on the molecular side of the plant nutrition, plants can actually just be absorbing straight amino acids and straight protein. So instead of having to absorb a mineral and then take sugar that it's made, converting that mineral to an organic compound, the plants can just absorb organic compounds straight from the soil, which gives them an excess reserve of energy to then put into those secondary metabolites I was talking about, which are the flavor, nutrition, and medicinal compounds, with the sugar synthesis. And that insects have a pretty simple digestive system, and sugars is a very wide concept. So you have monosaccharides, disaccharides, oligosaccharides, polysaccharides, which basically is just fancy ways of saying how many chains of sugar is it. You have one sugar, 2, 3, or 20 or 100. And glucose and fructose are monosaccharides. They're single sugars. Those are the first compounds made by a plant photosynthesizing. And then as a storage mechanism combines those into sucrose, which is glucose and fructose combined, which is a disaccharide. The more sucrose you have stored in your plant is kind of an indicator that everything's flowing properly, but it's also key with the insect resilience in that the sucrose being a disaccharide, the higher the level of, the larger of an insect it won't be able to digest it, basically. And so, because it'll turn into alcohol in their guts. So really tiny bugs like spider mites and aphids, they have the simplest digestive system. So it's called a Brix level BRIX. 0 to 32 degrees is the scale. Most farmers are at about 2 to 4. It's not till you hit about 12 that you start seeing resilience to spider mites and aphids, and it's small insects that have very relatively simple digestive systems. And basically what that measurement's measuring is the level of this disaccharide sucrose. And so the higher the level, once you get to like 14, 15, 16, 17, you actually start being resilient towards beetles and grasshoppers, and you can even get up to locusts at a certain point. But at that point, it's a combination of the disaccharide, the sugars that will ferment and turn to alcohol in the guts of the organism, but also that plants, when they have all this excess energy, they can actually produce what are called phytoalexins, or different compounds that'll actually kind of chemically ward off the insects, essentially at the point of like where the insect's biting it. Basically with all that, it's super, super key to understand that the health of the plants, not only like nutritionally for us as consumers and as people trying to seek out, even like medicinally, like if you're looking for plant medicine, these spiritual or sacred compounds that these plants are producing, the levels of these compounds they're producing, and even the spectrum, in the sense that the excess energy that a plant has to produce higher levels of, like say for example, cannabis. Like, so you have cannabinoids, it can produce higher levels of the ones we know about, like THC or CBD, or ones we've already been measuring. It's like, okay, there's a jump there, but it also now has so much extra energy that it's now actually producing a wider spectrum. Now it's not only just producing higher levels of single compounds, it's producing a wider diversity of more compounds, which is amazing in any plant, really. It provides so much more of a nutritional or a medical benefit. And but then also the inverse side of that is that a truly healthy plant is immune to bugs and disease, and so which is really, really good news for everyone, really, because for farmers, it's so much of their budget goes towards that, and then also from an environmental standpoint, so much of the damage comes from the war on bugs. And then the last one being the plant microbiome. And so with kind of in that whole same sense that when the plant's really healthy, it's not only is its own chemical physiological integrity on point, but actually the organisms inhabiting it. Just how we have a gut microbiome and the plants have the root microbiome and soil microbiome I was talking about. They have a microbiome going up their entire vascular system, like up the trunk, not only inside of it, but on the surface, and then as well as the leaves. And so leaves, just as the soil is supposed to be full of disease suppressive organisms and just kind of benefit, not so much disease suppressive organisms, but just be in a disease suppressive state because it's full of so many beneficial and commensal organisms. The leaf is supposed to be the same way, and so which that transfers into not only over time the environment in terms of as that now you have the surface inoculated with these beneficial organisms, so when it goes to the soil, it's just that much more beneficial to the whole system. But as a consumer of, people talk about eating probiotics and fermented foods, which is really important, but also a lot of just eating wild crafted foods generally, or food that's farmed with this, and knowing about it's called the phylosphere. So you have the rhizosphere, which is the root ecosystem. You have this phylosphere, which is the leaf ecosystem. And as long as you have farmers that are aware of this kind of ecology, you will get kind of a probiotic inoculation from eating that produce. But also just wild crafted stuff is really good in that sense, that it's got that kind of indigenous flora on the surface. But last kind of key tip with all this is that one of the more exciting things is one of the newer things is because before it was understood that the organisms I spoke about mine minerals from the soil, and then they're eaten by that predator class, and then those minerals are then released in soluble forms, which the plants soak up, which is true. But there's also what's called rhizophagy, or the concept that plants, it's now known that actually plants will actually absorb entire microbial cells into their roots and either digest the organism entirely or incorporate it as an endophyte, which means an organism that lives inside of its cells as a probiotic, or they'll actually they'll kind of like almost squeeze the nutrients out of it and then release it back into the soil. And so they're finding out that plants can actually absorb, because before we thought only plants could absorb tiny little small mineral particles, and then it kind of, as they pull the thread, they're like, oh, okay, they can absorb kind of medium-sized molecules, but now it's like, oh no, they can absorb entire organisms. That literally, like, and the key here, the point is that the complexity of, basically, instead of a plant having to absorb phosphorus and then put sugar to the phosphorus to turn it into a ribose thing, which then to turn that into a chain of ribose to make DNA, it can literally just absorb a whole DNA strand out of it and break it down. And so all the energy that would have been involved in that process of converting that pure mineral to this large macromolecule is now saved, because the plant can just absorb this entire large macromolecule as a whole. And so getting to this point of peak plant health and having all this energy is very, very important. It's very dependent on having a really healthy soil food web and a living soil ecosystem. And it really just compounds and gets better, and just so much of that, the momentum and the nutrition and the nutrient density that was lost, that, you know, people get the kind of doom and gloom of like, oh, we've lost so much of the nutrients in our food. It can really quickly be regained in just a short amount of time, and that was it.
And you have the product solutions for that.
Oh yeah. If check me out, Real Solutions. We got a range of like kind of formulas and materials and stuff to help farmers, and also provide testing services like for measuring the nutrient density of the plants and the microbes and minerals in the soil and stuff. So yeah. You can just go to actually real.solutions. We'll take you there. Or also gaia-zyme.com/real solutions.
He's on our website too, if you want to check the link on there.
Any questions?
Right here, question. I have a yard that's nothing but weeds and clay soil. What's the first step to turning it into something usable?
Well, if you just let the weeds do their thing, it'll turn into usable soil, but it'll take a while.
Okay.
So if you want to fast track that, you're like, okay, well, I don't have 3 years to wait, I want a garden now.
Yeah.
You can expedite that by basically do the in situ or the ex situ. You can cut that biomass down and either let it lay there and decompose and rot into the soil, or you can take it off and compost it. But with that, you need a good amount. It'd have to be a pretty good size lot, because you need the pile to be a certain size. But I'd say ideally, yeah, cut the green, and depending on how much organic matter, like depending on how long it's been kind of left fallow, you'll have a good amount or a not so good amount of organic matter. If there's really none, you'll kind of want to till in a little bit to begin with, like get some compost, till some of that in, and then just once. You don't have to keep tilling it, but just to get your topsoil layer as deep as you'd want your rooting zone to be. Kind of till in some organic matter there, ideally some minerals too, like a good organic fertilizer blend. And then once that's tilled in, then that biomass that you chop down, just mulch it back on top. So after you're done tilling it, and just water it and let it do its thing.
Did you pick up that now?
Cool.
You picked out what it said?
And then mommy cut it out and I cut it.
Is that like this is the basis of
My name is Fred.
plants and for humans. So for people who are
To the
in
end.
cities,
And I am strong. I am strong.
would you be able to get all of this into like one plot,
Mhm.
one plot where like you maybe don't get a ton of minerals. There's only so much a body absorbs from supplements.
Totally.
Like, is it possible to have just like a tiny little terrarium of all the micronutrients that you need and have that be effective? Or at least getting some.
To have everything you need, that's a good, now you got my head spinning, I'm like, it's a good experiment. But you can employ these tactics on a small individual scale. It's the whole thing with permaculture and basically the whole thing with nature is it's like the more elements you take away, it just means the more work you're going to have to do. And so with that, with being like in a pot in an apartment, say, like extreme scenario, rather than, because if you're on a balcony or something, it's a little easier if you can do like a bed, like a little raised bed or something like that. But if it's just individual pots, basically you can kind of get all-in-one kind of formulas that are like blends of like the carbon, the microbes, the minerals, in like a liquid solution or something. Just kind of hand water every once in a while, and then really like get some good because you can buy, it's kind of like probiotics. Like it's like you can buy a powdered probiotic in a jar, but the diversity and the activity of it is going to be nowhere near what a good fermented food's going to have, like a kimchi or sauerkraut or like yogurt or whatever. The diversity and the activity is much higher in like a real world fermented food versus a lab cultured probiotic. And so you can buy kind of plant probiotics that are powdered, which is easy, but ideally just get some good compost and then even just make like an extract out of it. And might be a little involved in an apartment, but like you can buy it in small containers, pails or bags or whatnot, and then just make an extract and apply it.
Is there a certain compost that you recommend that you could buy?
I really like, and this kind of came up recently. I was helping them source some, and I recently I knew about this guy years ago. I almost forgot about him. There's a guy it's out of New Mexico, so it can be a little. The whole thing is it's tough to find locally, but the whole thing is because there's kind of two grades of compost. You have inoculum grade, which is mainly for these organisms like I was talking about, like it's just rich in the bacteria and the fungi, and you can take a small amount of it and treat a really large area because you're really just going for the organisms attached to it rather than the substance itself. Or there's kind of more just general turf grade compost, which you want to apply to the soil. So for inoculum grade good compost, there's a guy out of Albuquerque called Soil Secrets, and they have a good compost. And then locally, there's more and more people starting up, but it's kind of you'd almost be better off, like if you need a good volume of it, almost kind of just going to a local compost supply, getting that, and then buying a small amount of that high quality stuff, because it's not cheap. It's like, I mean, it's relatively cheap, but it wouldn't be cost effective to apply on a large scale. But you can take a small amount of it and inoculate your larger pile of kind of lower grade stuff.
What was the name of that small amount that you're talking about?
Soil Secrets is the company.
Yeah, I got that.
An inoculum grade compost. And there's a good resource for that is Elaine Ingham or Soil Food Web Inc. Elaine Ingham is she's the Michael Jordan of soil biology. Like she's wrote the book and is teaching it still this day. And she has a company called Soil Food Web, and they consult and it's kind of like they're training more people. So it's like, that's why I was like, I don't really know of anyone under her network that produces this stuff continually, but in the future there'll be more and more people.
And then besides this, what you're saying is that you could till any kind of plant. You have plants that are decomposing into the soil, just let it sit.
Yep, you can till it in, and with green matter, it's kind of a mix. I would like to cut it. It's depending on the scale. Like if it's a huge scale, but on a small scale, like I was saying with him, I would cut it, till in some compost, and then just put it on the surface. Because when you till in the green material, you get a huge nitrogen flow. Like it can be beneficial, but it's almost easier to just let it sit on the surface. And ideally, if you're going to till anything in, have it be more decomposed. Like have it be the humified stuff rather than raw living stuff. And any other questions? So the ideal, it's kind of it's a mix. It's a rabbit hole. So if you read the traditional textbook, it's 6.3 is the pH that plants is kind of the perfect range where plants absorb minerals at. But that's it's a half truth in the sense that is true in a sterile environment. like in a purely chemical sense, a root membrane will absorb this mineral ion at this particular pH range. But in a biological sense, the pH could be 8.2, and you could have a living organism that can take that mineral and feed it to the plant directly. And then even further, like I was talking about, with these new understandings of plant nutrition, that plants can actually absorb or instead of the organism feeding the plant will actually absorb that entire organism and pull the minerals out of it. And so the ideal range is about 6.3, but you have what's called the bulk soil pH and then the rhizosphere pH. And so your bulk soil can be 8, but if you had a tiny probe, and if you have a healthy living soil that's got lots of carbon, all these organisms I'm talking about, there'll be this little microclimate, an atmosphere right around the root, what they call the rhizosphere, and that pH can be a perfect 6.4. And so it's over time you can kind of alter the pH of the soil through different means, but it's just because your soil has a high pH doesn't necessarily mean you can't start growing crops in there before
No more questions.
the bulk's at that point. So
You gotta do the kids thing. You did awesome.
one more time.
Fermented compost.
Yep, you can even get fermentation in soil. Like if it gets too, because fermentation has a lot to do with the oxygen content. If it goes aerobic or versus anaerobic, so if it gets too compacted, you can have a lot of your organic matter ferment and turn into alcohol. And it's kind of the big key is the alcohol. And so if you can ferment material, and as long as once the alcohol evaporates and there's just this leftover fermented material, that you can apply to the soil. But you just want to make sure that the alcohol content's low. But there can be other things like you can get formaldehyde production and stuff. So really the big key is if you're going to do anaerobic stuff is apply like a culture of a beneficial, what it's called a facultative an organism that is can be both anaerobic or can live in both a high oxygen or a no oxygen environment. And so it'll dominate and make sure you don't get any production of you get more of a pickling rather than like a distilling, if that makes sense. Yes.
Awesome. Thanks, Rory. Nice job. The professor sharing some knowledge. Thanks, man. Appreciate it. All right, I guess we need the kids. Kids. Can I get the kids to the stage?